Hello everyone, good afternoon and welcome to our webinar, Indigenous Peoples' Rights to Exist, Self-Determination, Language, and Due Process in Migration, the Child's Perspective. My name is Chloe Walker and I am a senior staff attorney at the Children's Immigration Law Center, or CILA for short. For those who are not familiar with CILA, we are a legal resource center and a program of the American Bar Association located in Houston, Texas. Our mission is to empower UC champions, advocates who work with children in deportation proceedings with courage, compassion, creativity, and competency. And to learn more about our work as a capacity building organization, you can visit our website, www.cilacademy.org. So as advocates for children facing deportation, many of you bear witness to the unique vulnerabilities and migration experience of Indigenous children passing through federal immigration shelters and detention centers and living in your communities, as well as the barriers they must overcome to communicate, to seek basic needs like legal and medical help, and to retain their cultural identity in a system that isn't designed to facilitate that. Part of our commitment as advocates to children facing deportation is a constant need to learn about the history and culture of the children we serve so that we can best connect with our clients, create a safe space to gather information, and ultimately empower them to put forth their strongest legal case to meet their individual goals. As is beautifully put in the resource that you have received, trying a different approach can mean letting go of hard-taught edicts that emanate from formal legal training or a bicultural lens that has not yet been informed about Indigenous societies. So today is our lucky day because a new lesson is on the horizon. We just have to let in the early light of its dawn. And thank you, that comes from our speaker, Blake Gentry. So we are excited and humbled to be joined by our speakers today from the International Mayan League and the Alianza Indigena Sin Fronteras, who I will introduce in just one moment. But first, a few housekeeping notes. This webinar is being recorded and all participants are automatically in listen-only mode. So if you do have a question or a comment during the presentation, please type it into the Q&A box. And we are going to be addressing questions at the end of today's webinar. It will be very helpful to the speakers if when you ask the question, you let them know your organization and your role when you type it into the chat box. And we do hope to get to everybody's questions today on the webinar. We do have quite a lot of participants on the webinar today, so it's possible that we may not get to every single question. You should have received an email, actually 2 emails from me earlier this afternoon with the handouts and PowerPoints that the speakers will be making reference to during their presentations. So please have those available if you'd like to reference them during the presentation. If you did not receive those, you may have registered after I pulled the list, so I'll be sure to get those to you after the webinar. And if you have any technical issues during the webinar, my colleague Vicky Giambra will be womaning the chat box to help address them, so please just feel free to send a message there. And at the end of the webinar, you'll see a link to a survey pop up, and we'd really appreciate your feedback. If you are licensed in Texas, a licensed attorney in Texas, this webinar has been accredited for 1.5 hours of CLE, including 0.25 of ethics. So if you would like us to report that CLE for you, please do fill out the survey and fill in your bar number. And on the survey, there's also an opportunity to let us know if you'd like to stay connected to our speakers and to share your contact information there. So now I would like to introduce our distinguished speakers today. Juanita Cabrera Lopez is the Executive Director of the International Mayan League, which is a grassroots Indigenous women-led Maya organization founded in 1991 by Maya refugee men and women with allies from the sanctuary movement. Juanita is Maya mom from the Western Highlands of Guatemala. She is a survivor of the internal armed conflict in Guatemala and a former political refugee. She has both personal and professional work experience in the defense of Indigenous peoples' human rights. Her focus has been to use international law and organizations and traditional knowledge for the development of an Indigenous human rights response in the areas of immigration, land rights, and environmental protection. She works with Maya leaders and elders in Guatemala and the United States through their traditional institutions. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and its full and effective use and implementation is a key pillar to her work. She holds a Master's of International Public Policy from Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. And it is through her work with our next panelist to the UN Universal Periodic Review of the United States that CELA was made aware of the groundbreaking work that both of these organizations and all of these speakers have done to document the experiences of Indigenous youth in the immigration system. And that was with Dr. Patricia Gonzalez, who is the Executive Director of the Alianza Indigena Sin Fronteras, an organization whose mission is to affirm the rights of Indigenous peoples, their right to self-determination, their collective human and civil rights, and the rights of sovereignty and the protection of sacred sites and the free, unrestricted movement across international borders. Patricia is Kickapoo, Comanche, and Mahua, descends from 3 generations of traditional healers and teaches about Indigenous medicine and Indigenous knowledge at the University of Arizona. She is a traditional birth attendant and herbalist and is author of several books, including Red Medicine, Traditional Indigenous Rites of Birthing and Healing. She's a former national columnist and has won several awards for her writings, including Human Rights Awards. And she has worked on Indigenous language policy and planning. As a 2018 to 2020 faculty fellow in the Agnes Nelms Program in Environmental and Social Justice, she is engaging the next generation of Indigenous advocates with elders and Native rights activists associated with the Alianza. And last, we are also joined by Blake Gentry, whose expertise is with Indigenous peoples from Guatemala and in the US borderland, specifically Indigenous language transmission in immigration settings. Blake is a member of the Cherokee Nation with an undergraduate degree in Latin American Studies from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, non-degree graduate studies in Native American Linguistics from the University of Arizona, and a master's in public policy with a concentration in international development from the University of Pittsburgh in Pennsylvania. Blake's experience spans 26 years with the Indigenous rights and community development in Petén, Guatemala, and at the Arizona-Sonora border, over 2 years in the Matamoros and Brownsville border area, and 3 years in the Ojibwa Treaty Rights in northern Wisconsin. We're so delighted to have you, and I'm going to pass it over to Juanita to begin the presentation.
Good afternoon. It is a pleasure for me to be with you all today. I want to give thanks to the American Bar Association for this invitation, and particularly to Victoria and Chloe, who've been working on the background and helping us be here today. Really appreciate your support. I'm going to start by sharing a couple of words in my language, because part of this presentation is about honoring and remembering the traditions and the cultures that the children that you work with come from. Danmi kmiankiach, danmi chuchoch, danmi miankich, danmi chua. In my language, I said, thank you to Heart of Sky and Heart of Earth, Heart of the Wind, and Heart of the Water. It's also a reflection of the cosmovision that we have as Indigenous peoples in our inherent way of seeing and being and living with the world, and how we pay respect to these elements that are essential to our survival and to our living experience. And part of the philosophy and the mindset that the children that come crossing these borders bring with them, as this is part of the fabric of who we are as human beings, as people from distinct cultures, traditions that are thousands of years old. Part of today's goal is to share some of the particular history, the traditions, and the cultures that we come from, and understanding that there is a particular place, needs, and rights that we as Indigenous peoples have, not just from Guatemala, from all of what we call Abya Yala, or the Americas, but for my presentation, there'll be more of a focus of the Maya perspective and the Maya diaspora. And really for Indigenous peoples, the displacement that we have lived in the context of violence and repression and persecution has been one for more than 500 years. And for many of our leaders and elders, they talk about eras of displacement and 4 waves, beginning with the invasion of the Spanish in 1524, liberal reforms of 1871, then looking at the most current wave, which happened in my lifetime, which was displacement caused by war and genocide. And now in the 4th displacement by forced development, transnational corporations, and the continued conflicts around lands, territories, and what the Western-based model says are natural resources, and what Indigenous cosmovision calls natural sacred elements. And I placed here actually corn from, this is a view actually from my home in Guatemala, because we also, for Indigenous peoples from Guatemala, we consider ourselves as people of the corn, and the whole narrative and cosmovision and story of corn is a very deep and rich piece of who we are as a people and transcends borders. This is part of, this map shows the rich diversity of Indigenous peoples in Guatemala. We are 22 Maya peoples, Xinca and Garifuna, and Mestizo. So there is a deep diversity of Indigenous peoples, all with their distinct language, culture, cosmovision, traditions, histories. And so the main, if I'll show here, these bigger colors represent the ancestral territories of different Maya people. So for instance, it'll be Maya Ixil, Maya Chuj, but these little circular pieces are mining licenses. And so what we want to show here is the imposition, the overlap of mining concessions, whether they're in exploration or exploitation phase, over traditional lands of Indigenous peoples. And this goes back to how I began the presentation, where I gave thanks to the elements, thanks to life. And this is an expression of how Indigenous peoples across the board have, for time immemorial, lived with our environment. And therefore, around the globe, about 82% of the world's biodiversity is found in Indigenous peoples' lands and territories. And why that is relevant to this conversation today is because a huge part of the conflicts around human rights are because of access to these this biodiversity, which we have conserved through our cosmovision, but which also places us at risk for human rights violations. So our forced migration is connected with conflicts over lands and territories, which I have talked about, persecution, criminalization, in case of the Maya, most recently genocide, where more than 200,000 of our people were either killed or disappeared. Structural impunity, meaning we live in a de facto apartheid because our people do not have the same opportunities to health, to education, to economic opportunities, and therefore Indigenous peoples are some of the most impoverished and vulnerable communities throughout all of Guatemala, and this is even more so for children. Lack of access to economic, as I have said, and then also the barriers that come because of gender. And so during the 1980s, as I had mentioned before, more than 200,000 people were killed and 1.5 million were forcibly displaced. So where did we go? Where did the root drivers of forced migrations then have these migration routes? Well, as you can see here, we pretty much went everywhere. refugee camps in Chiapas, which is the photo of the two children. That's from early camps in Mexico, and then all throughout the United States. Let me go back. Why is this information relevant to our conversation today? Because if we look at the wave of unaccompanied minors and youth from 2014, and then the newer waves that have been happening in 2017 through now, if we look at the historical context and the connection between the people who are now being forced to come, oftentimes it is the children and the grandchildren of the areas where there were mass genocide, where there was massacres, where there was scorched earth policy. And so we cannot leave history in the 1980s and the 1970s, but rather look at how those root drivers of forced migration have not been addressed and how they continue to impact the numbers that we see today. Flash forward to the numbers from 2014 and through 2020 from apprehensions, and I focus specifically on children, unaccompanied minors, because that's our focus for today. But if we look at the numbers, we consistently see for pretty much all of the years except for fiscal year 2014, we see that the highest numbers are consistently from Guatemala. And then if we know a little bit about the history, which I've shared, is that Guatemala is a predominant indigenous country, even if the official government statistics say we're about 40%. From self-reporting from our communities, it's probably closer to 80%. So what that means is that within these numbers of apprehensions that are shown here that were taken by Customs and Border Patrol, is that we actually have potentially hundreds of thousands of indigenous children who are being apprehended at the border within these statistics, and whose story is completely invisible throughout this process, because all we see is Guatemala. We don't see any breakdown by indigenous nation, and therefore we don't see the different needs that are an extension of our identity. So I just wanted to make sure that we did see some of the faces of the most prominent victims, though we know that there has been a diversity of what the victimization of our children looks like. But the most prominent ones that made the news cycles were these children, they're indigenous children. Claudia Patricia from my nation, she was actually born in the village next door to where I was born. Jacqueline Cal, Maya Kekchi, Felipe, Maya Chu, Juan, I'm just going to move this, Maya Chorti, Carlitos, Maya Achi, and Wilmer Maya Chorti. And unfortunately, what ended up happening in the process of the media telling these stories is that they didn't tell a complete story. And therefore, it also furthers the erasure of our indigenous children, the erasure of our identity, and it perpetuates a false narrative. It perpetuates the narrative that we are, Hispanic children or Latino children or Central American children, but it doesn't highlight the fact that these are indigenous children. Just quickly with Felipe from Maya Chuch Nation, he actually comes from a region that had one of the worst massacres in 1982, and about 300 people were killed in one day. And so their whole area was never fully able to recover from this large-scale massacre, and fields were burned down, villages were destroyed. And so years later, there's still a place that is extremely impoverished, only one school that I think doesn't even go to like 8th grade. And so a lot of the children or their parents see the need to leave these spaces because they see no future for their children, which is why in this slide, we say indigenous children are especially vulnerable, and some of the most excluded within Guatemalan society. And then when they come here, the level of vulnerabilities and violations increases. And this, as we know, happened in 2018, 2019. These are not cases that happened 30 or 40 years ago. And so I think, you know, we can't just dwell on things that are negative, but also see the Indigenous-led leadership and response, which is part of the outcome that we see here today, and the alliance that we have between the Indigenous Languages Office, the Indigenous Alliance Without Border, and the Maya League, where we were able to go ahead and try to start to change a narrative around, as I showed in the numbers earlier, that there's hundreds of thousands of children coming through in the last several years, but no real documentation of who they are. And I know my colleague will go into further that in the presentation, but we really wanted to start getting some data and research that was Indigenous-led and driven, and a majority Indigenous women within the process to start documenting these human rights violations, and to be able to not only document them, but then to use it as a tool for policy change and for advocacy, because we were able to have a specific narrative. And so that's how our formal report to the United Nations was completed, was through this Indigenous led effort. And I want to invite my colleague, Dr. Patricia, if you would like to say something within this slide.
All right, hello everybody. Thank you again to the ABA and the staff for inviting us to speak. This was an important collaboration because what we find is so often we are statistically eliminated. We are invisibilized as Indigenous peoples through what we call statistical omission. And so thinking about sins of omission, you know, it's like what we don't do. So what is it that we do not do? What is it we do not think about as we are interacting with Indigenous peoples? And so we had to piece together this report based on our own research, based on reports such as several that Blake Gentry had conducted as technical reports for various independent groups, because the US government isn't documenting the original peoples of this continent coming to Indigenous lands. Because when we arrive at these borders, they are Indigenous lands. And in particular, we're in Tucson, we are on O'odham land. And so this was a great concern for us as the Alianza. How do we then create a story or take control of the data? So as an academic, we would call this data Indigenous data sovereignty, so that we took control over the numbers, the statistical portraits, through both narratives, the stories, and documenting the numbers. But again, we had to create it was a small but significant study. But what we need, and so I think this is then where what's important for various agencies that or nonprofits that are also interacting in this system, is the importance of creating a narrative through various, whether it's creating some kind of having a category in intake forms, which we had thanks to the Indigenous Language Office. So as I understand it, our Indigenous Language Office in Las Alitas is the only one in the country. And so that's what made this also so significant, that we had all of these Indigenous peoples who understood the importance of having an office, of asking the question. We have Chicana and a longtime human rights activist working in Las Alitas that would come to us as part of the Alianza, talking about how people weren't getting diagnosed correctly for health conditions because no one was speaking to them in their own language. And so, so this is an example of how statistical omission then has an impact on this story. And I think what's really important is that we need various bodies to start to document the peoples that they are interacting with correctly, because you don't have the whole story if you do not know who they are. And so the languages represent philosophical systems that people can defend themselves with. Language is a defense. So by not having that language, then not having things in their own languages, in our own languages, then we actually do not have the full defense of not only of our rights, but of our knowledge. And the people most vulnerable are the people who still have access to the languages that are, yearly we hear about the United Nations concern over the daily loss of languages around the world that represent these deep systems of knowledge, systems that allowed people to survive and to resist colonization and various forms of repression. So I think that I just wanted to give some perspective on that, and also understanding the stigma in the context of the countries, of the nation states that people are coming from. Because of the stigma, often people, indigenous peoples, are reticent to assert or to reveal that they do speak a native language or need assistance in a native language, because of the racism that they've experienced in the territories where the nation states where their homelands are. So then that also requires extra kinds of finessing and questions to make people feel comfortable to be able to reveal something that could be a protective factor here as they are seeking protection within the US system. One of the things that happened with me and my grandmother, and I just want to end with this, is my grandmother went back to Mexico. She was Kickapoo when my great-grandfather was passing away, and she was not allowed to return for 6 months. And we had to make we had to do a big family effort to document her rights to come back into the United States. And I remember at one point she told me, she says, I can defend myself in my language, but she couldn't speak her language to those officials. So I think that that's something that always stuck with me, is the power that my grandmother had, what she could have, relied on in this process. Instead, it was a lot of external, we had to do a lot of external organizing to bring her back, and we were successful in doing that. But it is important to understand language as something much more than a policy issue, but it is truly a moral issue. It's an ethical issue. And so when I think about sins of omission, think about in your own structures, what are you admitting? Maybe not from any kind of, an intentional way, but structurally, but from questions not coming up, questions not even being on the radar. Then what are the sins of omissions within this process of the immigration system? Thank you.
Thank you. And what Dr. Patricia has said goes into the next slide in terms of some of the issues that we, on the statistical omission, and then being also reclassified as Latino or Hispanic, and that being a part of the bigger problem of not having the correct resources and response to our families, to the children, because of this misclassification. And also, as was already mentioned, the denial of our culture, of our spiritual, political rights throughout the immigration system, because language is but an expression of us as not only at the individual, but also at the collective level as a nation. And I know that Blake will talk more about this in terms of the particular places of contact. I wanted to go ahead and just end on a couple of pieces that we had come up in terms of some larger recommendations on what to do about this type of exclusion, both in the UN report that we put together, as well as a resolution that we wrote with the National Congress of the American Indians, which is now part of their policy. But in terms of really looking at a systems approach on looking at how do we move beyond this exclusion that is not only a violation of our right, but it is an inherent way of causing tremendous harm to our peoples in the context that we're living right now. For instance, with COVID-19, it actually is a life and death situations for hundreds of thousands in our community. And so looking at a place that we as Indigenous peoples, as cultural experts, as language experts, can be a place to create some sort of language advisory committee and work in tandem, whether it's with civil society organizations or governments, on how to move into these best practices from an Indigenous human rights perspective. And then, of course, we continue to ask for reporting on the deaths of all of the children, but particularly with the Indigenous children from an Indigenous human rights framework as to why our children, there's still no justice from the deaths of all of the children that you saw in the previous photos. Of course, the role of government, of Congress, and oversight and transparency over DHS. Also, that using international mechanisms in terms of the UN Special Rapporteur and having an in-country visit, fact-finding. Perhaps that could be something that, if that were ever to happen, some of the groups on the border could be able to facilitate spaces of dialogue and data collecting that the Special Rapporteur could do. And then, of course, allocation of financial resources for the different agencies and departments throughout points of immigration that need to be educated on the particular needs and rights of Indigenous children, of Indigenous peoples, because when our needs and rights are not even part of the conversation, then a whole host of human rights violations occurs. And so I will end there and give the space to my colleague Blake, who will go into further detail. Thank you.
Osio Ani, ABA Sila. That's a greeting from myself, Blake Gentry. I'm a member of the Cherokee Nation. And before I start, I want to thank my elder, Butler Welch, for his role in teaching me to believe in the Cherokee Nation. I want to give a little bit of parallel background, as Juanita did, in terms of the displacement of Mayan peoples from Guatemala, both internally and externally. My own tribe has its own historical story of our own migration from our homeland, which was at the base of a volcanic mountain, which would probably have placed us in Mesoamerica, either southern Mexico or Guatemala itself, over 10,000 years ago. A second phase of our displacement was in the 1800s, fairly well known in US history books, 1839 to 40, the removal called in English the Trail of Tears. And my family was on that trail. We lost 25% of our population. By 1907, the United States had yet another idea after they herded us and many other tribes in Indian Territory in the center of the United States. They decided to, for the fourth time, disappear our peoples and our government, and they did a roll called the Dawes Rolls, which is the only way that you can be an official member of a tribe in that period, whether or not you were there. And after the Dawes Rolls, the state of Oklahoma was created, and all of the tribal nations that had territory and land and governments, we were made illegal. We were brought back again in the 1950s because they discovered this thing called oil, and they legally could not take the oil from the trust lands that we had that were still held for us by the United States government. And then finally, in the 1950s, there was a policy called termination, which is official policy of the United States. And those who survived termination are still with us today, or we are the succeeding generations. And one of those was my big brother, as we call them in Cherokee, is actually my uncle. So as I am with the work here, I am always reminded of our own particular backgrounds. I want to say one more thing, and that is there was a picture there of people in the lower left-hand corner of that gathering that Patricia alluded to and Juanita mentioned in Tucson. And by my count, there were 10 people in that picture. 2 of them were not Indigenous. However, there were 12 Indigenous nations represented, because several people have 2 or 3 different Indigenous nations within their own family. And this amalgamation is also part of the displacement process. It's also part of the relationships that have always been there between Indigenous peoples. And it's something that's also important to realize. So I am going to show these slides and we'll move forward here. Juanita mentioned the diaspora, the Mayans in United States. This is from that data that we collected in the shelter from 2014, July 15, 2014 to August 1st, 2019. It represents 1,331 intake interviews of an adult who said that their first language, their primary language, was an indigenous language. And that is the question that we asked them: what is your primary language? Each one of those persons, for 99% of them, also had family members with them. So this represents much more than that number that you see there. Those were just the head of household that was interviewed. You will see here the places of origin. You saw the places of destination. These are the places of origin. This is practically a map of Mesoamerica. You see the different numbers of people coming from these areas. And our information showed that of all the immigrants in our shelter, that 1 in 5 or 20% over that time period from 2014 to 2019 consistently demonstrated that 1 out of 5 or 20% were indigenous language speakers. We are sure that the number is higher. One reason we know is that oftentimes women would not identify their language, but in the transcourse of the interview, their children would wander off, and then they would talk to their children in their own language to get their children back to the table. And I will address the reasons why that occurs in a bit. I want you to look at the center though. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but the dark place there with the dark blue is Huehuetenango, Northwest Guatemala. That's where the largest number of language speakers come from our data, and those are Maya Mam speakers. The other highlands area in that place will be another map later, but in that highlands area is where the other preponderance of speakers come from the north of Guatemala, in the large area there called Petén that I'm familiar with. There are other folks who come. You'll see over to the right, Honduras. There were a few Nahuatl speakers. Nahuatl is a language originally spoken by people in the Valley of Mexico, including the Aztecs. That's a pre-colonial migration, and those are Nahuatl speakers in Honduras. In Mexico, we see from Guatemala, Chiapas, Oaxaca, and Guerrero. It's very faint there, but also speakers of languages from those different communities. Here's a map of the languages in detail. It's a little bewildering, but you will notice that in the western part of Guatemala, where you have the bright colors, the yellow, the green, the light green, the oranges, you will see that most all of these, I think it's about 8 of those languages, and the 12 are from the highlands. We have a few that are from eastern Guatemala. The white areas on this map are Spanish-speaking dominant areas, but you can see in the southeast, the southeast area, the Chorti, Pocomchi, Pocomam, those areas, the Achi are in the middle, and Cachiquel are sort of on the edge of the highlands and central Guatemala. And we also have the Mixteco speakers, or Mixtec Alto. There are 2 prominent dialects within Mixteco, Alto and Bajo, but there are many variant dialects as well. But that's just to give you a sample that we also have saw folks who spoke those languages in the shelter as well. This map shows routes taken by migrants in general, not just indigenous language speakers. The curvy lines are not exact in terms of the routes because I couldn't get them to behave, so pardon that, but it gives you a central idea of what we deal with. We are very familiar with the Pacific Coast migrant route. Most of those people who come to the shelter in Arizona come on that route. And indigenous speakers have been coming to Arizona, documented at least since 1979, because they were arriving at the orange groves in Queens Creek, Arizona, which is just south of Phoenix, getting in vans and going to Indiantown, Florida. We know that this is a route that's controlled now. It was previously a route often during that period that I mentioned in the 80s, 79, the 80s, by the Cachiqueles, but this route then became dominated by cartel smuggling, and that's controlled by the Sinaloa cartel. The other route that you see in red, people do take that as well. They tend to be more from central, northern, or eastern Guatemala, excuse me, and they go through, they arrive in Texas, either through Tamaulipas, which is the state on the right, or through Nuevo León, where you see Monterrey. And that route goes there. What we don't know is the number of indigenous speakers going on that route, because we don't have any collaborating organization in Texas that has actually gathered data, with one exception. This is a demonstration of a change of variance in The languages shown up in the first period, 2014 to 17. You see all of those. Those are all from Western Guatemala. And then in 2017 to 19, additional languages started to show up, which means that the displacement in Guatemala of indigenous peoples was increasing and more widespread. That refers back to some of the push factors that Juanita was discussing, conflicts with mining and displacement because of other reasons. And those languages, a few of them are from the East and a few of them are from the West. And so we have in 2019, in this graph, and then additionally from information from other sources, every single Mayan language showed up in our shelter in 2019 of the 22 Mayan languages, plus Garifuna as well, and Miskito. I'm going to go into exclusion. And this is the process. Sorry about this slide, I can't make it any better, but this is the process that perhaps you all are more familiar with, or at least you know that some immigrants go through. This is about families. I will show children next. And I'm not gonna go through, I'm not gonna walk you through every single part of this. The point of this is to demonstrate the bewildering panorama of agencies and departments that indigenous peoples as immigrants go through, as well as other immigrants. If they're in the interior, they're gonna be arrested by ICE. If they're on the border, they're arrested by the Border Patrol. They're sent to Border Patrol, and then Border Patrol transfers them to ICE, and then ICE will take them to a facility, either long-term detention, or if their families, they may release them. What we end up here is with a number of contacts, and I don't, sorry, I'm gonna look for a reference here real quick. Well, they go through a series of contacts. I think it's like 7 to 12 minimum, meaning just from transfers one to the other through the whole court process, which are the yellow boxes, Department of Justice. And then eventually they either win the case or they go on appeal through the Board of Immigration Appeals, or they get deported. So this is the structure of what happens, and it is the structure of exclusion itself, because it demonstrates what happens with indigenous is at first contact when they're arrested by the Border Patrol, either at the port of entry or outside the ports of entry, they are immediately spoken to in Spanish. It is only if they're mute and don't speak anything at all will they not be spoken to in Spanish. And this is where the problem begins. And that exclusion then carries through their entire experience as immigrants in the US immigration system, unless in court, which is the place where they would possibly receive interpretation. Next is the children's situation. This is as well bewildering, but even more so. Indigenous children are the most vulnerable, or the most vulnerable social group in immigration today. They have very little defense. There's little communication going on with them. They also pass through the same process, except there's other agencies involved, Department of Health and Human Services, Department of Homeland Security, Department of State, the ORR, ICE, Border Patrol, and on it goes. Those contacts then mean that they're put in a shelter. These are the services on the right. You see the different bands of color there, the different symbols, and the types of services that they're supposed to receive. At the initial screening, the case managers have a chance to try to detect their language. If they do detect it, from my understanding, the greatest concern is to make sure that they're going to be able to communicate with them in terms of that particular interview. The other services then after that initial one, then they're going to receive in English or Spanish. These agencies oftentimes proudly boast of their bilingual education programs, but of course that bilingual education is in English and Spanish and not in an indigenous language. Their daily contacts pile up. The longer they're there, the worse it can be for them. If they're there 7 weeks, if it's the 1 to 2 month stay that was happening maybe a year ago during the time of separation and children being put in children's detention, they could easily have 189 exclusionary contacts because every single day they're exposed to this environment that doesn't include their languages. What does this mean? There's past research that's been done, but precious little research. The Florence Project in Arizona in 2009 did a study, and they showed that indigenous children didn't have the capacity to understand the deportation order, the Form I-770, when the Border Patrol would present that for their signature. As well, adults that we surveyed In 2014, even though they reported to be bilingual, quote unquote, in Spanish and in their language, 56% of them didn't understand the explanation given by ICE in terms of them needing to appear when they went to their destination in the interior. And I think that's it for this section. So it's back to you, Juanita, and I will. So you're up, Juanita.
I'm sorry, I don't have the outline in front of me, but I think we're going to end with some of the COVID response, if I'm correct.
Perhaps just a comment on what it means when immigrants, indigenous immigrants, are encountering officials and their sort of experience that they might have there, maybe in your community or the interior. And I think I commented on that already.
Yeah. It actually goes to some of the comments and questions that I'm seeing. So part of the, as I had mentioned earlier in the slides from the PowerPoint, was some of the historical factors in terms of the indigenous experience of being persecuted in the case of the Maya, well, in case of all indigenous peoples across the Americas, persecution because of our indigenous identity. And so in many cases, the denial or hiding of our identity has been also a source of survival. And also the compounded factors of racism and discrimination and a lot of the internalized oppression and colonization that has come from a history that has been so marred with violence. And so what that has translated in terms of encounters in Guatemala, and I'll start there with authorities, has often been from the time of the genocide and the internal armed conflict, was a lack of trust towards government, towards authorities, because you couldn't trust anybody. And in many times, those who spoke out against the injustices that were carried out by the government were themselves either killed or persecuted. And so with that has come a history of not trusting authorities because it has been demonstrated time and again that those who are supposed to uphold the rule of law are the first ones to break the law. And so as that becomes part of the history of our peoples in the fabric of who we are in that collective historical memory, that also is a history that comes with us as we cross borders, as we heard in many of the testimonies from the border of really the bribery, the corruption that happens with police and other elements of authority throughout Mexico and their linkages with illegal groups, with the cartel, and then in the case for women and girls with a higher sense of being at risk for sexual violence and human trafficking. And so when it comes to then initial points at the border, there's already a fear factor of these entities. And so a lot of times there will be the submissive response or the pretending as if we know what is being said, because there's also that sense of fear and shame that we may not speak Spanish. And so the immediate thinking is to start to agree with everything. But always there's a distrust in authority figures. And that's actually one of the questions that comes up here, is that they understand that fear is a part of the process, and they have seen that for a lot of families and children from Guatemala, they won't engage in the services. And really what the trust needs to be built from leadership directly from the community. So for instance, if they finally get here to, in the case where we're located in the Washington, D.C. area, where we have a huge Maya Ixil community of about 4,000 people, and then the Maya community is perhaps up to 20,000 people. It's really working with the leadership from the Maya or from the Maya Mum or from the Maya Ixil communities to be the ones who are the outreach workers, who are the ones creating these linkages for community resources, for bridging cultural gaps. and seeing the leadership that's already in our communities as a sense and a source of strength to really address some of these root causes and these root factors that have come with us because of our experience of being constantly violated from authorities and from government and from institutions that should be upholding our rights. And so I will hand it over to Blake.
Thank you. I'm going to refer to a document which you received late, some of you. It's called The Status of Indigenous Language Speakers in the U.S. Immigration System, before we go into the other document, which is called Promising Practices. I'm going to point out three things very quickly. One is there was a survey in there by the Guatemalan government, and it's on page 2. You should take a look at it. And that survey of 62% of preschool, nursery schools, and elementary schools found that 64% of Indigenous children were monolingual Indigenous language speakers. We want this to be very clear because we want to dispel the myth that, well, people speak Spanish because they come from Guatemala. Here's information from the Guatemalan government itself. Another 20% were bilingual, Spanish and their Indigenous language, and another 20% or so were monolingual Spanish speakers. Point number 2, again in the same document, if you look on page 6, the scope of discrimination is important for us to get at. And it's very difficult because when the government, meaning the United States Department of Justice, doesn't release information about the numbers of speakers, even in immigration court, in their annual statistical reports out of the EOIR, we don't have those numbers, even though they do have those numbers. But we did a statistical analysis of the population coming through Arizona in 2014, and we found that if you apply that to Guatemalans, using the 20% primary language Indigenous rate, somewhere between 18,819 and 22,858 Indigenous Guatemalans were in the immigration system in that year alone. We also calculated for children, and it said to us that there were between 6,697 and 7,727 held by the ORR in 2014. We don't have this information directly because those agencies aren't being pushed to release that information. And this is one of the problems. Thirdly, on page 7, there is a description of what's happened with the so-called implementation of limited English proficiency program for those who come into immigration system and aren't giving interpretation. We know that there is not really an implementation of this, which is based on the program that is supposed to be put in place, and that comes out of Executive Order 13166. You won't hear me say that many times, but if you haven't ever heard of this executive order, you need to look it up. And you need to look up who has a responsibility under it, because it says any federal agency and any organization, nonprofit or for-profit, that is contracted with the federal government that provides services to people in the United States have to provide language access, and there is a program for them to have to to assess the language populations that they encounter and then come up with the resources to meet that need, which they're absolutely not doing. I'm going to move over now to promising practices. I'm sorry this is rapid, but I want to get into that because this is perhaps a beginning of an approach that you all might find useful. You will probably see things in here that you've already known or you've tried. I know that we are presenting to many legal assistants who work in these conditions, doing legal orientation programs in children's shelters, detention centers, and also there are attorneys, and there's also shelter personnel. So what I want to say is that it's important to try to understand how to not just bridge the gap, but present your presence there in a way which will engender trust with those children in order for you to be able to actually do your job. And I understand that your job is exceedingly difficult. There is, on page 3 of that same document, if you look at it, a couple of examples of why there's obscurity in terms of understanding Indigenous issues, cultural identification, and language. On that page, there's a description of Julia, a Guatemalan Indigenous Mayan woman. I won't go through that, you can read it. This was in a document which is an Inter-American Human Rights Commission report. And in that report, they have delineation of different psychological impacts of trauma. However, after this first paragraph, they never in a single sentence address the reality that Indigenous peoples might have a different experience with trauma than anyone else. So there's a symbolic representation of an Indigenous woman as the only example of any immigrant in their document, but they don't address how it is that this woman or someone in her situation who is an Indigenous woman would be affected in a differentiated way by trauma. This is part of the problem that we see. To the right, you will see a small picture from a document that someone from CILA sent to me. The document is Child Welfare and Unaccompanied Children in Federal Immigration Custody. It actually makes some very good recommendations. However, again, we see a symbolic representation. There's a child, there's 2 Indigenous children there from Guatemala, but there's no description or inclusion of them in terms of the consideration of why they're actually showed on this page. For those of us who've worked with Mayan for a long time, maybe some of you will recognize this. If you see the weepil on the girl on the left, then she can be identified as an Ashiel child. I'm moving on, page 5. This gets into the heart of it. And what I would say here is, I kind of, if I name this, the first part is sort of welcome to cultural confusion. The confusion is both on both ends. It's for the children and also for you. If you encounter Indigenous children and you assume that they have a Latino background and that they share the same kind of cultural norms that others do from Guatemala or from Mexico, and they're mestizo or Ladino and not Indigenous, then that confusion just multiplies every day. So what I'm going to try to set out here in this document, I'm not going to go over the whole thing, but I try to put steps in here to try to roll back some of the practices that I have seen both in shelter and that I've heard of in other places. And I'm also a party to this because we had to try out different things. There's no magic formula. But one thing we learned is the following. When you first enter the room, or they first enter the room, we do a big disservice to ever creating any bond with these children if we ask them, who is it that doesn't speak Spanish? What we need to do is ask, what we need to do is to ask, or to say, we are here and we want to hear from every language present in this room. We want to honor every language that we hear or that we know is with you. Because we find it more interesting for our job to know all of the languages that are here. This has to be said before you introduce yourselves, before you name your organization, before you say why you're there, or any other utterance. Because if you wait and the first thing that comes out is in Spanish, they will automatically assume or disassociate from the presentation that you are going to give them. This is not easy to do, but with training you can do it. We had to train ourselves, all of the intake workers, in Alitas, we have probably 100 volunteers who do that, and we regularly train people in this. So I would encourage you to consider doing that as a way of changing practice if you don't do it already. Another thing you can do, I'm moving on, page 6, when you need to, before you go into the shelter, get as much information you can from shelter staff within legal boundaries. If you know where they're from, try to find out what department they're from Central America or South America, their departments, in Mexico, their states, what department where they're from, what municipio they're from, and then get down to the level of which, in rural Guatemala, it would be canton or canton or aldea or village, or if they're in an urban area, there's ciudad. In Mexico, pueblo covers most of those. But try to get that information before you go in. So that you can, when you identify someone who speaks a different language, you can get to an interpreter who also has an interpretation language that would match them, with one caveat. You don't want the person to be exactly from the same village. It's very important to make sure they're not from the same village. In case that there is abuse that comes up or trauma that has to be discussed, you also want to make sure that interpreter doesn't have relatives who are from that village. Because you don't want any familiarity with the particular family that child comes from. But linguistic match is very important. There are other steps to take after your first encounter, how to come in, how to use some cultural symbols, because it is superficial in a sense, but it also at least will show some effort on your part so that these children recognize that you do care about where they come from and there's more than just one message. There is a form on page 10 which allows you to track this information, and I give step-by-step instructions that you can use some or none of or all of to get through this. And I want to move and as I end up here on page 15, perhaps Chloe or Rick, you could tell me how much time is left?
Yeah, we're at 3 o'clock, so we still have 30 minutes left, including time for questions. So.
Okay, I'll take about 4 or 5 minutes with this, and then we can go into Q&A. Thank you.
Perfect.
On page 15, we have a section on trauma. And I know that for those of you who are working with children, both in the shelter as shelter staff and for those who are doing legal orientation, there's a correct assumption that many or most of these children are traumatized. You have probably heard many of the trauma stories. You could probably come up with your own typology. What I did was take some of that from people that I know who work in those situations, and I delineated them on page 16. One of the things that came out that was new to me was that someone who has done interpretation professionally for 5 years for official cases said that there is reporting of abuse at home from those same families that people come from. And unfortunately, much of that abuse came from the mothers or women in that family, about 40% of those children that this person interviewed. So trauma has various forms. There's trauma to the family. Juanita talked about structural social trauma, and then those that affect people in the community, gang-related trauma, trauma on the journey, and then the trauma of being isolated in a shelter. Those are all there. One of the things that became clear with someone I spoke with, because there's been many interviews, is that for teenagers, what happened to them on the journey and the physical conditions that they were subjected to, the hardships, the lack of food, and journeys through the desert and so on in case of Arizona, that behavior was considered to be just normal, and they didn't consider it trauma, even though it obviously is. The other thing I would like to say is that it's difficult navigating. I understand when you're with Indigenous children and you're with a group. My sense is that these orientations are usually given in Spanish. If you have any other sources to do them in language, that would be good. But then you have the task of identifying the Indigenous language for those remaining children. And for their personal ID and data and perhaps their trauma background, it needs to be done individually, so that, of course, you're not exposing them to anybody else in the group. There may be other children in the same shelter that traveled with them, and there's reasons why you don't want their narratives to be shared. But we would also encourage you to think about trying to bring Indigenous children together in a group socially, even if you're addressing them in Spanish, to try to do some exercises or activities which would help booster or recognize their identity as Indigenous children. And we give instructions on how to do that. Some of that comes from the experiences of Juanita's communities, the Ixil community, that they have done there. Last thing I would say is that a distinction between how to approach younger children, those under 10 or 10 and under, and those who are 11 up, the teenagers. One of the things that Juanita related in the preparation of this document was that the younger children were able to express through drawings or some storytelling when they were given a space, their own social space to do that, and that needs to be apart from any relating of trauma of the adults. But the teenagers had a different reaction, and the response of the teenagers was that they felt that they couldn't bring up anything that was related to events of trauma with their parents because they knew that it would evoke pain for their parents. And so they were, in that context, in a sense, internalizing their trauma. And that's the first thing that they brought out, that's how they felt about even talking about it. So it's important for us to realize the differences, obviously, between the age groups. I know you do that in terms of your work of legal orientation, but in terms of dealing with people, trauma is more oftentimes better dealt with on a social level with Indigenous than it is individually. The social group is the family and the communities they come from. That recognition is really important, and to create or recreate that context at least as well as you can in shelter so that that comes out. So I'm sorry that this is very quick. I will point out on the last pages of this document, there's a couple of resources for you. There's a list of Indigenous languages from Guatemala. There's a couple of diagrams from a really great book, and you can see that reprinted with permission. There's a map of Guatemala so that you can track the departments when you're trying to interview and figure out where these children are from so that you can make a positive identification. And the very last thing I would say is, why are we thinking about this? Because there's basically 3 goals that we have in mind. The first one is that we need to proactively reduce the stigma of having an Indigenous identity and or speaking your Indigenous language. The second is that we need to ensure that there is a positive cultural identity between you and the children in the room. The third one is that we need to ensure linguistic veracity. We need to make sure that these children are able to communicate in the language, their primary language, which is their right. In the legal document I sent you, or I'm sorry, the language status document, in the back you will find references to 4 UN resolutions and the articles that relate to that. In addition to US law, Executive Order 13166, there are several, there are 3 to 4 UN conventions that stipulate the rights of languages. Those are also mentioned in the UPR report. And I would point you all to those if you feel like you have to throw your hands up and there's nothing that can be done or nothing that can be said. Wado. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Blake. Thank you so much, Dr. Gonzalez and Juanita. We did have a few questions about the documents that Blake is referring to there at the end. So I think on the screen share, I've showed you an example of the promising, a screenshot of the promising practices that our speakers have put together for those of you who are on the webinar. And it goes through step by step a lot of really wonderful tips and resources. And these were emailed out earlier today. We'll ensure, if for some reason that you did not get the email, we'll ensure that everybody gets these handouts. But I just wanted to bring them up on the screen and show everybody what you were referring to. Thank you so much. So I wanted to ask a few questions. We've had a few questions that have popped up on our Q&A. And the first one that I wanted to ask is, of all of the speakers, but you've mentioned the language barrier creates barriers to access to medical issues, to legal issues, and to advocating for particular vulnerabilities. And I'm wondering if you can talk about how we can encourage or educate Indigenous children to report themselves, perhaps if there have been any abuses that have happened, whether it was in the Border Patrol facility or in an OR facility, whether they're still there, whether they're out in the community.
I can address it, and I'm sure Juanita, you probably would like to as well. That question is very practical and very straightforward from the point of view of those working with children in shelters and legal orientation. What I would say is there needs to be a rethink about how it is that Indigenous children are in these shelters and how this issue can be approached. The problem here is there's some assumption that those who don't speak the language can somehow elicit information from children who speak a different language and then get the results that they need just through interpretation. So I'm going to distinguish here between cultural identity and interpretation. Interpretation is interpretation of a language that comes from a culture. Without cultural identity, the interpretation becomes oftentimes a very sterile process and a very scary process for those children. So the identity of the interpreter needs to be made known to the child. It needs to be clear and said that this person is from the same language speaking group that you are. If the child is old enough to know the geography involved and where their origin from, it needs to be shared with that person. There needs to be some time for that interpreter to get to know a little bit this child and to say hello and to try to put at ease as much as possible. Having said that, I also think that the major problem in most of the approaches that have been taken is that, to my knowledge, there aren't any Indigenous people working in these institutions. As an Indigenous person, frankly, I find it appalling. How do you change this? Well, how do you change it in any institution? You have to have requirements for cultural competency, and you ask people then to come and work for you who have that cultural competency, and the only way they're going to have that cultural competency is they come from those particular places. Can this be done? It certainly can be done. If you have 5,000 Ixil people in Washington, D.C., I'm sure you can find some culturally competent people to work in whatever legal organization is working around there. The same goes for Arizona, the same goes for Florida, the same goes for Texas, the same goes for California. So the more permanent solution here from my point of view is we need to start seeing Indigenous peoples brought in as cultural specialists, and not just to show up at the time of interpretation to try to make everything move smoothly from the point of view. How do we know this? Well, in our shelter, we've had these same issues. We have medical teams there. If we can't translate even anatomy into Indigenous languages, how do we know we're getting a proper diagnosis, let alone a treatment? And in the time of COVID, this can actually cost people their lives. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, sure. I'd like to answer it more from a systems approach, kind of what Blake was talking about. So if we go back to some of the previous slides that we put together, where we put a host of recommendations through, one, through the UPR report, and two, through the resolution language with the National Congress of the American Indian, where we talk about, as Blake has pointed out, the fact that these Indigenous languages are just not being included in the process throughout the immigration system. So looking at the expertise and the intellectual support and the cultural expertise of experts from the communities, and not looking at only Indigenous peoples from Mexico, Central or South America, but looking at the language experts, the cultural keepers who are experts of Indigenous nations here in the United States, and having an advisory board that would be able to detail out steps that would be consulted and some sort of consensus process, because this just doesn't exist. Another recommendation that we put in place was really looking at the part that actually needs to be done, because it is a part of our rights under the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, but it's looking at a comprehensive piece of education for those who are within CBP agents or ICE or HSS, in terms of what the particular needs and rights are for Indigenous peoples. And then a third piece looking outside of that system, but more of what's out here in the community for the few Indigenous peoples organizations or coalitions or co-ops that are doing this, is really helping us build up a process of what we're doing. In the case just with the Maya League, but I know that there are other organizations, is one, there is, and I've seen some comments on the side, there's a lack of qualified Indigenous interpreters that can respond to the host of needs that you all present, or clinics or hospitals or courts. And what we oftentimes get as an organization is somebody saying, can you just find me somebody who speaks Ixil or somebody who speaks Hmong? But there's no quality control. There's no assurance of the type of ethical and standards in terms of the quality of interpretation training that our community members can get. And so we have come up with a methodology to try to bridge that gap, but that requires funding to grassroots organizations, that requires supporting the community outreach workers to not be looked at as volunteers, but actually as somebody who could be part of a community organization, who can be part of a different way of interacting with our community. Because otherwise, as Blake has said, and perhaps in the experiences that you've had, it's just calling a random person because they happen to be part of that particular group, but they may not necessarily have the expertise that is needed at that time, or the training, or maybe they do have it, but they don't necessarily get brought in as somebody who is an expert. They're brought in as a community volunteer who can go ahead and do their goodwill in that. And what we're really talking about is a comprehensive approach that would really change the way that organizations are interacting with our communities, with our families, with our children, and recognizing that this leadership and expertise already exists within the different organizations, but that oftentimes our spaces are at the fringe of immigrant rights movement or at the fringe of legal organizations. And so we're also struggling to just make our existence known, make our expertise known, make these experiences of community organizing from an Indigenous human rights perspective known, but also uplifted in a way that would make our response sustainable and make our approach something that can be supported rather than constantly brought in as volunteers or not as the experts that a lot of our communities have. And going to Blake's point, and it'll be my last point, really looking at the issue of language in very real terms as not just a process of mechanical interpretation, but also looking at the interpreter as a cultural ambassador, as a cultural link, bridge between yourselves and your organizations and the very specific rights of that child or that family in that moment, because it opens up a broader conversation in terms of developing trust, especially within a context of so many layers of trauma that are both individual and collective in our communities.
Thank you both for that.
I wanted to say something,
okay.
yeah, just to kind of contextualize. I see a question too from Jennifer McCluskey, and I think that following up on what's been said by Blake and Juanita, for instance, I'm wondering how many of you are maybe, this is then I think some kind of thinking about where you focus your funding of really hiring the families as promotores themselves to reach out to their communities, because the reason that they're not, one reason that aside from the issue of fear is that very often Indigenous peoples do not feel comfortable interacting with systems that are so different from themselves, and that includes social services, mental health services. We had a small recommendation in the area, in the section where we were addressing trauma, regarding having culturally relevant resources, and Blake mentioned this. You know, we have, Indigenous peoples have very sophisticated healing systems that know how to address trauma. And so there may not feel that they need to go to a therapist, but there could be an alignment of, if you have traditional healers in your or elders that you have in your resources, or identifying them so that people might feel more comfortable accessing services through them, even as health promoters. Health promoters are really common in Mexico and Guatemala and Central America. They're often from their communities. They were actually the people targeted during the Guatemalan Civil War. So that is a familiar kind of role in communities that also could be a way to gauge some of those, to bridge some of those gaps. But it's also really understanding that you need to also try to find providers that have these, at least some experience with concepts of trauma, such as in Spanish, susto, that a lot of people would understand that word, but they're going to come from their own systems of knowledge as to how they understand that concept, that is a word in susto in Spanish, but they have their own words in their native languages that actually do have ways of addressing what we know today as trauma.
Thank you for that. Okay.
Chloe, can I add to that?
Yes, please.
Okay. I think what we're describing collectively and individually here is some issues at the level of practice and some issues at the level of policy, and how to bridge the gap. Juanita made some good suggestions, which are recommendations at the UPR, and as did Patricia right now. From my point of view, having been involved with this since 2014 formally, and before that for many years, because my experience is also for 20 years in Guatemala working with Quechua in health promotion training and translating from English to Spanish and Spanish into Quechua. I work with Quechua native speakers. There's one thing that needs to be understood, and that is well, let me just say this. If you encounter adults Guatemalan indigenous who are 30 years or older, it's most likely they were never exposed to the written form of their language. And that's because the bilingual education programs didn't start until the early 80s. If you have a youth, some youth, if they had the luxury of being in a public school in which there was bilingual education, may have a very basic understanding of how to write their language. So some of the things that the system has done are ridiculous. They're putting up these I speak posters, and you have adults who are 30 years and older who can't read them because they speak an oral language and that's how they know their language. And then you have youth who don't have legal comprehension of what process they're in, and they have an I speak poster and they may read it, but they literally don't know what that means, even though they can read it in their language. This approach has been pointed out to Border Patrol. I pointed it out to PR people, the Border Patrol here. It's been pointed out in a white paper that was submitted to ICE and at the national level. They're very well aware that these are, and first of all, they never created these I speak posters. They took them from the US Census Office. They make it sound like they've made an effort. They didn't make any effort at all from what we see on the ground. But there's other things that need to be done. One is the numbers of people who are indigenous children in these facilities need to be publicly released. There needs to be requests to EOIR to release these numbers from their league tables instead of just putting them in a league table. If that request isn't granted, then we need lawyers. I think there's some of you out there who know how to do FOIAs, and they need to be pushed to release these numbers. As well, I would say there needs to be a change in practice internally in the legal organizations to have a database which tracks indigenous language speakers so that they know if they're an indigenous language speaker. Only by modeling how we want this differently will we ever be able to push the US government to come up with something. It's pretty clear that their decisions aren't only out of negligence and omission. It's also clear that they're very well aware of this issue and they're trying very mightily to ignore it in the public because it's been brought up before them in public meetings with officials of ICE and with the Border Patrol in the Tucson sector of the border because we bring it up quite frequently. And I would second the thing that Juanita says, your agency right now that you work in can hire people as consultants for training. We're all available. You can also then hire people more on a permanent basis to become legal assistants, train them to do the legal assistance work, and realize that their skills are going to be as important as those who come from an undergraduate degree and they speak Spanish and they've traveled in Central America. I've worked with many of those legal assistants and they're all great people, but they're not indigenous. The other thing I would say is that if we can't move the federal government, and I've been trying and others have been trying since 2014, it's now 2020, then I think that there needs to be consideration of litigation. We need to identify law firms who are willing to litigate. There needs to be, as there have been for other issues on the border, class action suits. That takes resources and money and people willing to engage in that. But every government has the opportunity to reform. And if they don't reform, then oftentimes they need to be met in court in order to change structurally how it is that this system is getting away basically with violating rights when there's an executive order on the books that says that they can't do this. There's international conventions. And if you're a state organization or a state court, there's also Title VI. So those are some areas between practice and policy that I think could help start to bridge the gap.
Thank you, Blake. Yeah, and we've gotten lots of questions, and I think in answering some of them, the speakers have answered different levels of the question. There's obviously lots of different layers, so many systems and so many different approaches. I wanted to highlight one more question, and this is the question of when we're working with interpreters, for example, if the Mom language or Maya language is identified as the language, folks report that their client maybe says that the interpreter is actually speaking a different dialect or a different version of that language. There's a misidentification of the language. So I wonder if you can give us tips, and I think there are some tips also in the promising practices about how to further identify the correct culture and language connection.
I can go first. We actually have we have a very small pool of Indigenous language interpreters that we've been training. And so part of the form that we have is just a basic Google Doc form that asks, as Blake has already put together, you know, where they come from, what's their department, what town do they come from? Because as you have already said, within MUM, I'm MUM, so I'm from Quetzaltenango, which is a different MUM than Huehuetenango, then San Marcos, and there's MUM in Chiapas because the border that was imposed in our territories, actually our territory goes into what is now Mexico. And with Ixil, there are 3 types of Ixil variants. And so that information, as Dr. Patricia had talked about, it needs to go into what type of intake forms do you have? How are you collecting this information? And also understanding that Quiche and Kekchi, for instance, are distinct languages. They're not dialects. And so knowing that there's even 22 languages, and then within one language, there are dialects because there is a variance of MUM, but MUM and Quiche are distinct languages. And so sometimes we even get somebody who, you know, to no fault of their own, doesn't understand this and will throw in Quechua, which is from Ecuador, and say, you know, I need a Quechua interpreter. And so we'll have to go and ask them, is this Quechua or Quechua or Quiche, or because there are different countries, different indigenous peoples. And so this goes back to some of what we were talking about in terms of some staff training, looking at the tools that are being used within your agencies, within your firms, within your social service agencies, on how you're collecting the data, how you're approaching working with indigenous peoples as a very distinct versus Indigenous Latin Americans, which is an erroneous labeling as well.
What I would say is in the promising practices document made it explicitly so that you would have a step-by-step method in order to identify. Again, you need to do your homework, get the information that you can from the shelter personnel within your scope of legal right. In terms of whatever, you know, things are in the non-disclosure they can't allow you to have or you can have. If you can get that information about their country, but not just their country, their department and so on, then you can do your homework before you go in. You look at the map, you look at the language list, and you can see what languages are likely to come from that department. So it's just a little bit of detective work, and then you try to get an interpreter for that. We all make mistakes. You can get the wrong interpreter, and that's fine. Then you have to get another one. We were on a call with the professional language line, and I would say we, in the shelter, did 2 things. We have a language line. It's a service out of Portland. It's paid for by the Catholic Community Services, but we also have a roster of interpreters because as people come into our shelter and we identify them as Indigenous language speakers, we ask them if they would help us with interpretation, mostly after they've left and moved into the interior, but then later, another week or 2 later, someone else shows up with their language and then we call them. Why is that helpful? Because they know exactly what the process is because they've been in our shelter and they speak their language. The assumption here is it's bilingual English and, Spanish and those languages. I don't speak the languages, I speak Spanish, but we communicate and that's been an effective tool. The language line can work, we've done it before, but even kind of, you know, maybe in a way a funny mistake can happen. We had 5 mom speakers one day in a shelter when we were only in a house. And I called the language line and they said, yeah, we'll get a mom speaker. And the person came on and was talking for 5 minutes. And all of these women looked at me like they had no idea what this person was saying. And I said to the interpretation service, I said, I'm sorry, but they don't understand you. Well, you know, are you speaking mom? And she says, no, I'm speaking Hmong. So it's easy to get the wrong language, even those of us who do this all the time. So we just had to, you know, hang up and then wait for another 20 minutes. That service, interestingly, didn't have any Kekchi. They didn't know about Kekchi. They had never written down. They couldn't even pronounce Kekchi. Kekchi is the 2nd largest Mayan language in Guatemala. So even these language services aren't really equipped. It often goes to demand. And the more that you as service providers, if you have these contracts, start demanding to get these folks, then you can get them. You can also start to distinguish, especially from MOM, the dialects, the 4 or 5 dialect groups that are there. Again, we're available for consultation on how you would do that. That's a little more detail than I can throw into the webinar, but those things are possible to do. So those are tools to use. Once you've got an interpreter, then encourage the interpreter to be very sensitive to this child. Let the interpreter know what age they're handling. Also ask the interpreter whether they've ever interpreted for a case where there's abuse or trauma, because the interpreter will be affected by this if they're not used to doing it. So it's important to ask them if they can handle that. Thanks.
Thank you, Blake. All right, well, we are right at 3:30. I want to be mindful of time. So we're at the end of the presentation. I just want to say thank you so much to all 3 of our presenters and panelists today for your time, for your expertise, for your patience with us as you know, we continue to learn. It's an ongoing process in this practice. And there will be a survey that pops up when everyone closes out their screens, which will provide the opportunity to indicate that you would like to stay connected with our presenters and keep these conversations ongoing about how we can all continue to work together and collaborate together. And again, just thank you so much for your time. And we will end the webinar there.
Thank you so much.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Wado.
Kipichi.